The complete story of Shen. Shen was born on June 30, 1967, in Shanghai, China. He entered the world at a moment of profound upheaval. China was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long period of political chaos that would reshape Chinese society from top to bottom. The country was isolated from the global economy, closed to Western ideas, and gripped by ideological fervor. Shanghai itself, once the cosmopolitan jewel of Asia known as the Paris of the East, had been transformed into a drab industrial city where revolutionary politics dominated every aspect of life. Private enterprise was condemned as capitalist poison. Wealth accumulation was seen as evidence of counter-revolutionary thinking. Anyone with business experience or foreign connections faced persecution. This was the world that shaped Shen's earliest years, a world where the concept of venture capital would have seemed not just foreign but dangerous. The Cultural Revolution cast a long shadow over Neil's childhood. His parents were educated professionals who had experienced both the promise of early communist China and the terror of its political campaigns. They taught him to value education above all else, to keep his head down, to work hard within the system. But they also passed on something more subtle, a memory of Shanghai's cosmopolitan past and perhaps a hope that such times might return. Neil grew up in a modest apartment in Shanghai, sharing cramped quarters with his family as was typical for the era. There were no luxuries, few books beyond revolutionary texts, and limited access to information about the outside world. Yet even in this constrained environment, Neil showed an exceptional mind. He was curious, disciplined, and hungry for knowledge. He excelled in mathematics and science, the subjects that offered the clearest path forward in a society that valued technical expertise over ideological purity. The year 1976 marked a turning point for both China and for Neil's family. Mao Zedong died that September, ending an era of revolutionary chaos. Within 2 years, Deng Xiaoping had consolidated power and began implementing market reforms that would gradually transform China from a closed socialist economy into what he called socialism with Chinese characteristics. For Neil, who was just 9 years old when Mao died, this shift would eventually open doors that had been closed to previous generations. But the changes came slowly at first. China in the late 70s and early 80s remained a controlled society with limited freedoms and few opportunities for entrepreneurship. Still, the direction was clear. China was opening up, engaging with the outside world, and creating space for individual ambition that hadn't existed in decades. Neil's education followed a traditional Chinese path of intense focus and competition. He attended Shanghai's best schools, where he competed against thousands of other students for limited spots in top universities. The Chinese education system was brutally meritocratic, with everything depending on performance in high-stakes examinations. Neil thrived in this environment. He had the discipline, intelligence, and work ethic to excel. Mathematics became his passion and his strength. He loved the clarity and certainty of mathematical thinking, the way complex problems could be broken down into logical steps and solved through rigorous analysis. This mathematical mindset would later prove invaluable in evaluating investments and understanding business models. In 1985, at age 18, Neil gained admission to Shanghai Jiaotong University, one of China's most prestigious institutions. He enrolled in the mathematics department, immersing himself in pure and applied mathematics. The China that Neil experienced as a university student in the late 80s was dramatically different from the China of his childhood. Deng's reforms were accelerating. Special economic zones had been established in coastal cities. Foreign investment was beginning to flow in. Chinese students were being sent abroad to study. There was a sense of possibility in the air, a feeling that China was reclaiming its rightful place in the world after a century of humiliation and decades of isolation. But there was also tension. Economic reforms were outpacing political reforms. Corruption was rising. Inflation was hurting ordinary people. Students and intellectuals were debating how much freedom China needed and how fast change should come. These debates culminated in the spring of 1989 with the Tiananmen Square protests. Neil graduated from Shanghai Jiaotong University in 1989, the same year as the Tiananmen Square crackdown. The political turmoil that spring raised fundamental questions about China's future direction. For many Chinese students and intellectuals, the violent suppression of the protests was a profound disillusionment. Some chose to leave China, seeking opportunities and freedoms abroad. Neil made that choice. He decided to pursue graduate studies in the United States, joining the wave of Chinese students who would study at American universities and help build bridges between China and the West. In 1989, Neil arrived at Yale University to pursue a master's degree in mathematics. The contrast with Shanghai must have been staggering. Yale represented everything China was not at that moment. It was an institution built on free inquiry, open debate, and individual liberty. It had vast resources, world-class faculty, and students from around the globe. Neil's time at Yale exposed him to Western thinking in ways that would fundamentally shape his approach to business and investing. He encountered ideas about markets, competition, and entrepreneurship that were absent from his Chinese education. He saw how American capitalism worked up close, how it rewarded innovation and risk-taking, how it created tremendous wealth but also tremendous inequality. He also began to see opportunities. China was opening up but remained far behind the West in almost every dimension. Someone who understood both worlds, who could speak both languages literally and figuratively, would be uniquely positioned to bridge that gap. This insight, formed during his Yale years, would guide much of Neil's later career. He completed his master's degree in 1991 and made a decision that would prove pivotal. Instead of pursuing a doctorate and an academic career, he enrolled in Yale's School of Management to get an MBA. The decision to pursue an MBA marked Neil's shift from pure mathematics to business. He was moving from a world of abstract theory to one of practical application, from certainty to uncertainty, from solving known problems to identifying opportunities. At Yale's School of Management, Neil studied finance, strategy, marketing, and organizational behavior. He learned to read balance sheets and income statements, to evaluate business models and competitive positioning. He studied case after case of successful and failed companies, absorbing lessons about what made businesses thrive or collapse. But perhaps most importantly, he began to build a network. His classmates at Yale included future leaders in business, finance, and consulting. Many were Americans heading to Wall Street or Silicon Valley. Others were international students who would return home to build careers in their native countries. Neil was forming relationships that would prove valuable throughout his career. After completing his MBA in 1992, Neil faced a choice that many talented international students confront. Should he stay in America and pursue opportunities there, or return to China and bet on its future? The safe choice would have been to stay. America offered stability, a strong economy, clear career paths at established companies, and the possibility of citizenship and a comfortable upper-middle-class life. Returning to China meant uncertainty. The country was still recovering from the Tiananmen crackdown. Its economy, while growing, remained primitive by Western standards. The banking system was state-controlled and inefficient. Property rights were unclear. The rule of law was weak. But China also offered something America could not, the chance to be part of a historic transformation. Neil chose to return. It was 1992, and Deng Xiaoping had just made his famous Southern Tour, a trip to special economic zones where he declared that to get rich is glorious and doubled down on market reforms. Neil's first job back in China was with Citibank. He joined their investment banking division in Shanghai, helping multinational corporations enter the Chinese market and Chinese companies access international capital. This role gave him a front-row seat to China's economic transformation. He saw firsthand how foreign companies were struggling to understand the Chinese market, how Chinese companies were hungry for capital and expertise, and how vast the opportunities were for intermediaries who could bridge the gap. Working at Citibank, Neil developed crucial skills and relationships. He learned how to structure deals, how to negotiate with government officials, how to navigate China's complex regulatory environment. He also began to understand the unique characteristics of Chinese business culture, the importance of guanxi or relationships, the role of government in business decisions, the informal networks that made things happen. By the mid-90s, Neil had developed a deep expertise in China's financial markets and was becoming known as someone who could get things done. But he was also observing something fascinating. China's economic reforms had created a new class of entrepreneurs, people starting businesses in sectors that barely existed a decade earlier. These entrepreneurs faced a fundamental problem. They had ideas, energy, and ambition, but they lacked capital. China's state-owned banks would not lend to private enterprises. There were no venture capitalists or angel investors to speak of. The stock markets were tiny and heavily regulated. This capital gap represented a massive opportunity. Neil could see that whoever figured out how to fund China's entrepreneurs would capture enormous value. But the infrastructure did not yet exist. There were no venture capital firms, no angel investors, no established pathways for startups to grow. In 1996, Neil took a bold step. He left Citibank to co-found Ctrip, an online travel booking company. This decision marked his transition from banker to entrepreneur. Ctrip was born from a simple observation. China had millions of business travelers, but booking travel was a nightmare. You had to go to physical travel agencies, wait in long lines, deal with limited information, and hope for the best. The internet offered a solution. An online platform could aggregate information about flights and hotels, allow customers to compare options and book instantly, and take a commission on every transaction. The business model had been proven in the West by companies like Expedia. But no one had yet built it for China. Neil saw the opportunity and seized it. He and his co-founders, James Liang, Minute Fan, and Qi Ji, launched Ctrip in 1999. The timing was both perfect and terrible. Perfect because China's internet infrastructure was finally reaching critical mass. The number of internet users was growing exponentially. E-commerce was beginning to emerge. Young Chinese consumers were becoming comfortable with online transactions. But the timing was also terrible because the world was in the grip of the dot-com bubble. Internet companies with no revenue and no clear path to profitability were raising hundreds of millions of dollars at absurd valuations. When the bubble burst in 2000, it took down thousands of companies and destroyed billions in wealth. Many observers thought the internet itself was a fad, a technology that had been overhyped and would never deliver on its promises. In this environment, building an internet company in China seemed crazy. But Neil and his co-founders persevered. They focused on building a real business with real revenue, not just chasing user growth with no business model. Ctrip offered tangible value to customers and partners. For travelers, it meant convenience, better prices, and more options. For hotels and airlines, it meant access to customers without having to build their own online systems. The company grew steadily through the early 2000s, surviving the dot-com crash while many others failed. They combined online efficiency with offline service, operating massive call centers to handle customer inquiries and complaints. This hybrid model worked brilliantly in China, where consumers wanted the convenience of online booking but also wanted human assistance when things went wrong. In 2003, Ctrip went public on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. The IPO was a landmark moment, one of the first Chinese internet companies to list in the United States. It raised $75 million and valued the company at around $400 million. For Neil, who was in his mid-30s, this was a major success. He had helped build a company from scratch, survived the dot-com crash, and created real value for customers and shareholders. The Ctrip experience taught him invaluable lessons about entrepreneurship, about building businesses in China, and about what it took to succeed in the internet economy. He learned that great businesses solve real problems for customers, that execution matters more than ideas, that combining online and offline capabilities could be a powerful advantage in China, and that timing and persistence were crucial. After Ctrip's IPO, Neil could have stayed as an executive and enjoyed a comfortable career running the company. But he saw a bigger opportunity. China was producing hundreds of entrepreneurs like him and his Ctrip co-founders. Many had studied abroad, had worked at multinational companies, had ideas for new businesses, and were ready to take risks. But they faced the same capital problem Neil had faced. There was still very little venture capital in China. The few foreign VCs operating there did not really understand the Chinese market. What China needed was homegrown investors who understood both the Chinese market and how to build technology companies. Neil decided to become one of those investors. In 2005, he co-founded Sequoia Capital China with Doug Leone from Sequoia's US team and Kai Zhong. Sequoia Capital was already legendary in Silicon Valley. Founded in 1972 by Don Valentine, it had backed Apple, Oracle, Cisco, Google, Yahoo, and dozens of other iconic companies. Sequoia had a reputation for finding exceptional founders early, backing them with patience and support, and building lasting franchises. By the 2000s, Sequoia was looking to expand into China. The country's internet sector was exploding. Companies like Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent were emerging as major players. Sequoia saw the opportunity but knew they needed local partners who understood China. That's where Neil came in. He had the credibility as a successful entrepreneur, deep knowledge of Chinese business, relationships with entrepreneurs and government officials, and the ability to operate in both Chinese and Western business cultures. Founding Sequoia China was a bet on China's future. In 2005, China's venture capital ecosystem was still nascent. Total VC investment in China was measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, tiny compared to the tens of billions flowing into Silicon Valley. Most Chinese entrepreneurs had never heard of venture capital. Those who had were skeptical of foreign investors who did not understand their market. The regulatory environment was uncertain. Property rights were unclear. Exit options were limited. Chinese stock markets were closed to most private companies. That meant Chinese startups had to list overseas, usually in the US, which added complexity and risk. Despite these challenges, Neil and his partners saw enormous potential. China had the ingredients for an explosion of entrepreneurship. A huge and growing market with rising incomes, an educated workforce including millions of engineers and scientists, an entrepreneurial culture especially in coastal cities, improving internet infrastructure, government support for technology and innovation, and the success of first-generation internet companies like Alibaba and Tencent proving what was possible. Sequoia China's early investments revealed Neil's ability to identify exceptional founders and emerging trends before they became obvious. One of their first major bets was on JD.com, an e-commerce company founded by Richard Liu. When Sequoia invested in 2007, JD was a small player compared to Alibaba. Alibaba's Taobao platform dominated Chinese e-commerce with its marketplace model connecting buyers and sellers. But Neil saw that JD's direct sales model, where the company bought inventory and sold it directly to consumers, could win in certain categories. JD focused on electronics and other products where customers valued authenticity and fast delivery. They built their own logistics network, something that seemed crazy at the time. Why would an e-commerce company want to own trucks and warehouses? But Neil understood that China's logistics infrastructure was terrible, that customers were willing to pay for reliable fast delivery, and that vertical integration could be a competitive advantage. The JD investment demonstrated several principles that would characterize Neil's approach throughout his career. First, he was willing to back contrarian ideas that went against conventional wisdom. Everyone said marketplace models were superior to direct sales. Neil bet on the opposite. Second, he recognized that what worked in the West might not work in China and vice versa. Amazon's model made sense for China even though Alibaba's marketplace model had won first. Third, he appreciated the importance of execution and infrastructure. JD's logistics network seemed like a burden, but it became their moat. Fourth, he had patience. JD took years to prove its model and compete effectively with Alibaba. Sequoia stayed with them through multiple rounds of funding. The investment paid off spectacularly. JD went public in 2014 at a valuation of over $20 billion. Sequoia's stake was worth billions. Another early investment that showcased Neil's vision was Meituan, a group buying and later food delivery company founded by Wang Xing. When Sequoia first invested in Meituan in 2010, the company was just one of thousands of Groupon clones in China. The group buying model had exploded in the US with Groupon, and Chinese entrepreneurs rushed to copy it. At the peak, there were over 3,000 group buying sites in China. Most would fail within 2 years. But Neil saw something special in HongShan and Meituan. Wang was a serial entrepreneur who had already built multiple companies, including Shen, a Facebook-like social network he had sold. He was thoughtful, strategic, and obsessed with execution. More importantly, Wang and Neil shared a vision. Group buying was not the end game. It was a wedge into local services. If you could get millions of consumers to try local restaurants through discounted deals, you could build a platform that connected consumers with all kinds of local services: dining, entertainment, travel, eventually even food delivery and hotel bookings. Meituan's journey was brutal. The group buying wars of 2011 and 2012 saw massive cash burn as companies fought for market share. Hundreds of millions of dollars were incinerated on subsidies and marketing. Most players went bankrupt. Meituan survived by being disciplined about unit economics, by expanding into adjacent services, and by relentlessly focusing on customer experience. Neil and Sequoia supported them through multiple rounds of funding, believing in Wang's vision and execution. By 2013, Meituan had won the group buying wars and was pivoting to food delivery. By 2018, the company had merged with Jinping and went public at a valuation of over $50 billion. Sequoia's investment had returned more than 100 times. The Meituan story illustrated Neil's ability to see beyond the immediate hype cycle to identify the long-term platform opportunities. Neil's pattern recognition ability was perhaps most evident in his investment in ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok. When Sequoia first invested in ByteDance in 2012, the company was just starting with an app called Tushiro. Tushiro was a news aggregator that used machine learning algorithms to personalize content for each user. The idea was simple but powerful. Instead of editors deciding what news to show, algorithms would learn what each user liked and surface relevant content. This kept users engaged much longer than traditional news apps. But many investors were skeptical. Content recommendation was not new. Personalized feeds were not revolutionary. The technology was not that hard to replicate. Why would this particular company win? Neil saw what others missed. He recognized that Zhong Yiming, ByteDance founder, had a unique combination of technical excellence and product sense. Zhong understood machine learning deeply and had a vision for applying it beyond just news. More importantly, Neil saw that recommendation algorithms would become increasingly powerful as they accumulated more data. Every user interaction made the algorithm smarter. This created a flywheel. Better recommendations led to more engagement, which generated more data, which improved recommendations further. It was a classic network effect but applied to machine learning models. Neil also bet that Zhong would expand beyond news into other content types. That bet paid off when ByteDance launched Douyin in 2016, a short video app using the same algorithmic approach. Douyin became a phenomenon in China. Then ByteDance launched the international version, TikTok, which became one of the most successful apps ever created globally. By 2020, ByteDance was valued at over $100 billion, making it one of the most valuable startups in the world. Sequoia's early investment had returned over 200 times. More importantly, the ByteDance bet revealed Neil's ability to identify paradigm shifts before they became obvious. He saw that algorithmic content recommendation would reshape media and entertainment, that Chinese companies could build products that succeeded globally, not just in China, and that the next generation of internet giants would be built on machine learning and AI. These insights positioned Sequoia China to invest in the next wave of technology companies. Neil's investment philosophy crystallized through these and dozens of other investments over 2 decades. He developed a systematic approach to identifying winning companies and founders. First, he looked for founders with missionary zeal. The best entrepreneurs were not motivated primarily by money. They were obsessed with solving a problem, building a product, or creating something new in the world. Wang Xing at Meituan, Zhong Yiming at ByteDance, Richard Liu at JD, all shared this quality. They would have built their companies regardless of whether venture capital existed. Second, Neil valued learning speed over initial brilliance. Markets changed constantly. Business models evolved, competitors emerged. The founders who won were not those with the perfect initial plan but those who learned and adapted fastest. He watched how founders responded to setbacks, how they incorporated feedback, how they evolved their thinking. Third, Neil looked for businesses with strong network effects or economies of scale. The best internet businesses got stronger as they got bigger. More users meant more value for each user. More data meant better algorithms. More transactions meant lower unit costs. These dynamics created winner-take-most markets where the leading player could dominate for years. Fourth, he bet on China-specific opportunities. Neil did not simply copy Silicon Valley models and apply them to China. He looked for problems that were unique to China or where Chinese solutions could be superior to Western ones. JD's logistics network, Meituan's integration of online and offline services, ByteDance algorithmic content, these were not straight copies of American companies. They were innovations designed for Chinese market conditions. Fifth, Neil was willing to back founders through multiple companies and multiple market cycles. He built long-term relationships with exceptional entrepreneurs, supporting them even when individual companies failed. This patient capital approach was different from many venture capitalists who abandoned entrepreneurs after a single failure. Neil understood that great founders learned from failure and often succeeded on their second or third attempt. Sixth, he focused on execution as much as vision. Ideas were cheap. Every smart person had ideas. What separated winners from losers was relentless execution, attention to detail, ability to recruit and retain talent, and skill at navigating complex competitive and regulatory environments. Neil had built Ctrip himself. He knew what execution required. He could spot founders who had that rare combination of vision and operational excellence. The scale of Neil's success at Sequoia China is staggering. Between 2005 and 2020, Sequoia China invested in over 400 companies. Many became household names in China and beyond. JD.com went public in 2014 valued at $20 billion. Meituan went public in 2018 valued at $50 billion. ByteDance reached a private valuation of $140 billion by 2020. DJI became the world's largest consumer drone company. Pinduoduo went public in 2018 and quickly became one of China's top e-commerce platforms. NIO emerged as a leading electric vehicle company. Across e-commerce, social media, financial technology, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and enterprise software, Sequoia China's portfolio companies represented the cutting edge of Chinese innovation. The financial returns were extraordinary. Industry estimates suggest that Sequoia China's funds generated returns of 3 times to 5 times invested capital on average, with some funds returning much more. For limited partners in Sequoia's funds, major university endowments, foundations, and pension funds, the China investments were among their best-performing venture capital commitments. For Sequoia Capital as a firm, the China operation became one of its most valuable franchises. Neil himself became one of the wealthiest individuals in China, though he remained relatively low profile compared to flashier entrepreneurs. More important than the financial returns was the impact on China's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Sequoia China helped legitimize venture capital as an industry in China. They set standards for how investors should work with entrepreneurs. They created a talent pipeline, with former Sequoia employees going on to start their own companies or venture firms. They demonstrated that Chinese companies could achieve global scale and compete with American tech giants. Neil's success also reflected broader changes in China's economy and society. When he started Sequoia China in 2005, China's GDP was $2.3 trillion. By 2020, it had grown to $14.7 trillion, making China the world's second-largest economy. The number of internet users in China grew from 100 million to 900 million. Smartphone penetration went from nearly 0 to over 80%. Mobile payments went from non-existent to ubiquitous, with China leaping ahead of the US in financial technology adoption. E-commerce as a percentage of retail sales surged from almost nothing to over 25%, higher than the US. Chinese technology companies went from being seen as copycats of Western companies to being innovators in their own right. This transformation created the environment for Neil's venture capital success. But it also raised complex questions about the role of technology companies and investors in Chinese society. As Chinese tech giants grew more powerful, they faced increasing scrutiny from regulators and the public. Concerns emerged about monopolistic practices, exploitation of workers, especially delivery drivers and other gig economy workers, data privacy and surveillance, financial risk from shadow banking activities, and social impact of addictive apps and algorithms. The Chinese government, which had largely taken a hands-off approach to internet companies in the 2000s and 2010s, began to tighten regulations dramatically starting around 2018 and accelerating in 2020 and 2021. The regulatory crackdown reshaped China's tech sector. Ant Financial's IPO, which would have been the largest in history, was halted at the last minute in November 2020. Alibaba was fined a record $2.8 billion for anti-monopolistic practices. Didi, the ride-hailing giant, was forced to delist from US stock markets. Tencent faced restrictions on gaming. Education technology companies were essentially destroyed overnight when the government banned for-profit tutoring. ByteDance faced pressure over content on its platforms. For venture capital investors including Neil and Sequoia China, this regulatory shift created new challenges. Companies they had backed faced investigations, fines, and restrictions. Valuations plummeted. Exit opportunities through IPOs became uncertain. The playbook that had worked brilliantly for 15 years, back fast-growing internet platforms that leverage network effects and data, suddenly seemed risky. Neil navigated this challenging period by adapting Sequoia China's strategy. The firm shifted focus somewhat from pure consumer internet to enterprise technology, artificial intelligence and machine learning, electric vehicles and renewable energy, semiconductors and hardware, and biotechnology and healthcare. These sectors were more aligned with the Chinese government's priorities as outlined in its Made in China 2025 plan and other industrial policies. The government wanted China to achieve technological self-sufficiency, especially in areas where it depended on Western technology. This created opportunities for investors who could back Chinese companies building critical technologies. Neil also maintained relationships with government officials and regulators. Unlike some Western investors who saw the Chinese government as unpredictable or hostile, Neil understood that the government was a stakeholder that needed to be engaged. He worked to ensure that Sequoia's portfolio companies understood regulatory expectations and complied with new rules. This pragmatic approach was characteristic of Neil's overall philosophy. He was not ideological. He adapted to circumstances. When the environment favored consumer internet, he backed consumer internet companies. When the environment shifted to enterprise technology and deep tech, he shifted too. By 2023, Neil was one of the most respected figures in global venture capital. He was ranked repeatedly as one of the top venture capitalists worldwide by publications like Forbes and Fortune. He had invested in dozens of billion-dollar companies. He had helped build Sequoia China into one of the premier venture capital firms in Asia, managing multiple billions of dollars across several funds. He had mentored a generation of Chinese entrepreneurs and investors. He had also maintained a remarkably low public profile compared to many venture capitalists. He rarely gave interviews. He did not seek publicity. He let his investments speak for themselves. This discretion was partly cultural, reflecting a Chinese preference for humility, but also strategic. Avoiding the spotlight helped him maintain relationships with both entrepreneurs and government officials. Looking at Neil's career in totality, several themes emerge. First, he has been a master of timing. He returned to China just as it was opening up. He started Ctrip just as internet infrastructure reached critical mass. He launched Sequoia China just before the explosion of Chinese internet companies. He backed companies in emerging sectors just before they became hot. This timing was not luck. It reflected deep understanding of technological and market trends, relationships that gave him early visibility into opportunities, and willingness to make contrarian bets before consensus formed. Second, Neil has bridged multiple worlds. He is Chinese but educated in the West. He is an entrepreneur but also an investor. He understands technology but also business fundamentals. He operates in China but maintains global relationships. This ability to operate across boundaries has been central to his success. He can evaluate Chinese companies using Western analytical frameworks. He can explain Chinese opportunities to Western limited partners. He can help Chinese entrepreneurs think about global expansion. Third, Neil has consistently backed contrarian ideas. When everyone said marketplaces would dominate e-commerce, he backed JD's direct sales model. When everyone said group buying was dead, he backed Meituan's expansion into local services. When everyone thought content recommendation was not a big opportunity, he backed ByteDance. These contrarian bets required conviction and courage. They also required the ability to see patterns that others missed and the patience to wait for those patterns to play out. Fourth, Neil has built systems and processes, not just individual investments. Sequoia China developed a reputation for professionalism, operational support, and network effects. Portfolio companies could access Sequoia's global network, learn from other founders in the portfolio, and get help with recruiting, financing, and strategy. This platform approach meant that Sequoia could add value beyond just providing capital, making them a preferred partner for the best entrepreneurs. Fifth, Neil has adapted continuously. His investment focus has shifted from consumer internet to enterprise technology. His approach has evolved as markets matured. His relationships with government have adjusted as regulatory environment changed. This adaptability reflects a core insight. Venture capital is not about finding a formula and repeating it. It is about continuous learning, evolving with markets, and staying ahead of trends. The lessons from Neil's career are profound for anyone thinking about investing, entrepreneurship, or navigating rapid economic change. First, local knowledge matters. You cannot simply take models that work in one market and apply them mechanically to another. You need to understand local conditions, culture, regulations, and customer behavior. Neil's success came partly from deeply understanding the Chinese market in ways that foreign investors did not. Second, networks compound over time. Neil's early experiences at Ctrip, his relationships from Yale and Citibank, his partnerships with entrepreneurs and other investors, all created a network that generated opportunities and information. He was not starting from scratch with each investment. He was leveraging decades of accumulated relationships and reputation. Third, being early but not too early is crucial. If you invest before the infrastructure exists to support a business model, you will fail even if you are directionally correct. Neil timed his investments to coincide with the availability of enabling technologies and market conditions. Ctrip worked because internet penetration and payment systems had reached critical mass. JD worked because logistics could be built profitably. ByteDance worked because mobile bandwidth and smartphone penetration supported video. Fourth, focus on founders more than ideas. Ideas change. Markets shift. Business models pivot. But exceptional founders figure things out. They learn, adapt, recruit talent, and persist through obstacles. Neil consistently backed founders who demonstrated these qualities even when the initial business plan was not perfect. Fifth, have patience and conviction. Venture capital returns come from a few big winners, not from many small successes. That means you need to back your high-conviction ideas with enough capital and enough patience to let them play out. Many of Neil's best investments took years, sometimes a decade or more, to reach their full potential. If he had sold early or not supported companies through difficult periods, the returns would have been far lower. Sixth, understand the broader context. Neil's success was not just about picking good companies. It was about understanding the trajectory of China's economy, the evolution of technology, the regulatory environment, and social trends. This big-picture thinking helped him identify sectors and opportunities before they became obvious. Seventh, adapt to changing circumstances. What worked in 2010 does not necessarily work in 2023. Markets evolve. Regulations change. Competitive dynamics shift. Successful investors continuously update their mental models and adjust their strategies. Looking forward, Neil faces both opportunities and challenges. On the opportunity side, China continues to offer enormous potential. It is still the world's largest market by population. It has a growing middle class with rising disposable income. It is investing heavily in technology, from artificial intelligence to quantum computing to biotechnology. Chinese companies are becoming more innovative, not just copying Western models. New sectors are emerging, including electric vehicles, renewable energy, synthetic biology, and advanced manufacturing. For an investor with Neil's experience and network, these trends offer continued opportunities to back winning companies. On the challenge side, the external environment has become more difficult. US-China tensions have escalated, affecting technology transfer, listings in US markets, and cross-border investment flows. The Chinese regulatory environment remains uncertain, with the government clearly willing to intervene in ways that destroy value for investors. Valuations in many sectors have compressed significantly from their peaks. Exit options have become more limited, with Chinese IPO markets more restrictive and US listings more difficult for Chinese companies. Competition in venture capital has intensified, with hundreds of firms competing for deals. And the easy wins from China's first wave of internet growth are gone. Future opportunities will require deeper technology and longer time horizons. Neil's response to these challenges will shape Sequoia China's next chapter. The firm has been shifting toward earlier stage investments where there is less competition, focusing on deep technology that aligns with government priorities, building out operational capabilities to support portfolio companies, maintaining discipline on valuations in a more difficult fundraising environment, and helping Chinese companies think about global expansion while navigating geopolitical tensions. The broader question is whether the venture capital model that worked so brilliantly in China from 2005 to 2020 will continue to work in the future. That model depended on several factors. A relatively hands-off regulatory approach that allowed fast-growing internet companies to operate freely. Abundant capital from domestic and international sources chasing growth. Large addressable markets in consumer internet with relatively low barriers to entry. Network effects that created winner-take-most dynamics. Relatively easy exit options through US listings. Many of these factors have changed. The regulatory environment is more restrictive. Capital is more cautious. The easy consumer internet opportunities have been captured. Network effects are being constrained by anti-monopoly rules. US listings are more difficult. In this new environment, venture capital success may require different approaches. Longer holding periods as exits become more difficult. More emphasis on profitability and unit economics rather than pure growth. Greater focus on technologies that solve Chinese government priorities. More operational involvement to help companies navigate regulations. Patience through difficult market cycles. Neil and Sequoia China are well positioned for this transition. They have the experience, relationships, and capital to adapt. But it will require different strategies than those that worked in the previous era. Shen's story is ultimately about seeing opportunity where others see obstacles, building bridges between different worlds, backing exceptional founders who can execute, having the patience and conviction to support companies through long journeys, and adapting continuously to changing circumstances. He has been one of the great investors of the past 2 decades, not just in China but globally. His portfolio companies have created hundreds of billions of dollars in value, employed millions of people, and transformed how Chinese consumers live, shop, eat, travel, and consume media. But Neil's impact goes beyond financial returns. He has helped build China's venture capital ecosystem, creating institutions and norms that will outlast any individual fund or investment. He has mentored entrepreneurs who will build the next generation of Chinese companies. He has demonstrated that Chinese investors can compete with the best in the world. He has shown that emerging markets can produce not just fast followers but genuine innovators. And he has built a model for how to invest in rapid economic transformation, lessons that apply not just to China but to other developing economies. The contradictions in Neil's career reflect broader contradictions in China's development. He has built enormous wealth in a socialist country. He has backed companies that empower consumers but also surveil them. He has operated in a system where the government can reshape industries overnight. He has benefited from China's opening to the world while that opening has become more constrained. These tensions are unresolved and may shape his legacy. Neil Shen represents a uniquely Chinese version of the venture capitalist. He combines mathematical rigor with intuitive pattern recognition. He bridges Eastern and Western business cultures. He balances entrepreneurial risk-taking with pragmatic adaptation to political realities. He has built one of the most successful investment franchises of the 21st century while maintaining a low profile. His career offers lessons about timing, founder selection, contrarian thinking, and long-term value creation. But it also raises questions about the role of technology and capital in an authoritarian system, the sustainability of China's growth model, and the future of cross-border investment in an era of rising geopolitical tensions. Neil's next chapter will reveal whether the strategies that created his success can adapt to a more challenging environment or whether a new playbook is needed for the next era of Chinese innovation.